Well, welcome everyone to our CFE support webinar series. Today, our webinar is about the path to competent and day 2. My name is Debbie Bailiff. Before I start, I want to extend a big thank you to CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and CPA Atlantic School of Business for this great partnership. They've worked together to ensure that this valuable information is available to you as you prepare to write CFE in June. Now, let me talk a little bit and outline some of the logistics for this webinar. First of all, the webinar is approximately 70 to 75 minutes, and then I will open the floor for any questions that you may have. During this webinar, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A function. So again, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. So my colleagues in the background will attempt to answer your questions. Now they may choose to save some of the questions so that they can ask me those during the Q&A period. If because of time constraints, we aren't able to answer your question, or as you review this webinar and you find that you have additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your region or your area. So I've included their email addresses here. Now, there's some common questions that we're always asked. So I want to provide the answers to those up front. Is this webinar being recorded? And the answer is yes. It should be available in approximately 2 days on the home page for Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. So just the same place as where you registered. The candidates ask us if they're going to have access to the slides. Unfortunately, you will not. However, the best thing is you do have access to the recordings, and most candidates go back and watch the recording again. And you can stop it if there's some valuable information and write down your notes accordingly. So, one of the key success factors when it comes to writing and passing CFE is to be able to create an efficient and an effective outline. So as a result, I'm going to be reviewing the planning process, and I'm going to use a sample day 1 case. I'm going to share with you a best practice on how to create an efficient and effective outline for the Elgar Day 2 case. So for those of you who are enrolled in Capstone 2, you're going to get to look at this case again during the module workshop. It's also very important that you understand what the Board of Examiners' expectations are when it comes to what qualifies as a competent response. So I'm going to share some of those valuable insights. I'm also going to discuss about the appropriate approach and structure that you should use when you perform a quantitative and a qualitative analysis, because structure matters. Why does it matter? Because it helps increase your chances of meeting the breadth and depth requirements. I'm also going to highlight some of the common problems that the board examiners find when it comes to financial reporting responses. So let's start with critical reading, outlining, and planning. So what are the benefits of planning? There's two main benefits. Having a planned approach will help you remain calm. Without a doubt, some of the CFE, particular to day 1, is a complex case and there's a lot of assessment opportunities. So you want to make sure that you have an approach that you consistently use, that you practice, so that's going to build that confidence. It's going to help you remain calm. What it also helps is it helps to increase your chances of meeting the depth and the breadth requirements. And I'm going to talk about depth and breadth several times. When it comes to the context of CFE, breadth is meeting a sufficient number of qualitative factors and or including a sufficient number of inputs when you perform your quantitative analysis. From a depth perspective, the requirement is the level of detail you need to provide. And when you perform a qualitative analysis, it's all about not simply restating those case facts, but including the answer to the question, so what? What is the potential positive or negative impact to the company? So to be successful, you need to have an approach that logically organizes your assessment opportunities. Now you're going to find I use that word assessment opportunities, required or asked. They're all interchangeably so that you can organize your information in your outline in such a way that you ensure that you meet the user's needs and you meet the breadth and depth requirements. So I want to read the first paragraph here, and this is from the Board of Examiners. Planning is the cornerstone to CFE success, and it's the most important phase in approaching a case. It helps you see the big picture and lays the foundations for a well thought out response. As a result, 25 to 30% of the length of the case should be dedicated to reading, creating your outline, and planning. Please do not fall into that trap where you feel like you need to start writing your response. You have limited time. Planning is essential. It helps improve your chances of meeting the requirements when it comes to what's needed for a competent response. So why create an outline? And when I'm talking about an outline, I don't mean simply listing the required. That's a shell. The goal is to create an outline so that you've extracted all of the relevant case facts so that you can turn that outline into a response. Because what that allows you to do is highlight the key case facts. If you have the relevant information already in your outline and it's in Word, you can quickly turn it into your response. Well, that helps you effectively manage your time. It becomes the roadmap for your response. And when you're determining how much time you should allocate and what order you should do your requirements in, it really helps you see the big picture. You have a better sense of how much information do I already have, because that determines what amount of time you should allocate for that particular required. So when it comes to outline, there's two main options. You can create your outline on paper, or you can create it electronically in Word. The best practice I'm going to share with you is to create your outline in Word. When I work one-on-one with candidates, I always say, I want to talk to you and I have a few questions to ask. And depending on the answers, this will give you a better idea of what you should do when it comes to your outline. So do you find it takes you longer to read the case? Are you missing required and or key case facts? When you start practicing the old CFE cases, are you struggling meeting the breadth requirements from a qualitative perspective? Are you feeling a big time crunch? If the answer to any or all of those top four questions is yes, using an electronic, creating your outline in Word could improve your response to those answers. In particular, I think about does it take you longer to read the case? And let me give you an example. Recently, the last CFE, one of my invigilators was walking around and came to me and said, I really have a concern about one of the candidates. And I said, tell me about why you feel that way. And he said, well, we're 75 minutes into day one, and everybody else has information, pages of information in Word, and this candidate has nothing in Word. Everything, I'm not even sure what she's doing. Well, the candidate was using and creating her outline on paper. What happened is everybody else had the information in Word. She was having to spend extra time to transpose that information. But ultimately, you have to figure out what works best for you. When it comes to the last question, if you're unsure of what you're being asked to do, I'm going to share with you a best practice of how you take that required, write it word for word, but break it down into smaller components because many times you're being asked to do more than one thing. So what I'm going to do, due to time constraints, I'm only going to share the best practice around creating a partial outline for the Elgar Day 2 case. I'm hoping that for all of you who have been enrolled in the professional education program, that this planning process, the 9-step planning process, looks familiar. Because as I go through and share this best practice, I'm going to go through each of the steps. So when it comes to day 2, everybody writes the same case. This case can be over 50, 60 pages long. So I wanted to show you the table of contents because there is information here that's not relevant to you. So you'll notice I've highlighted in yellow, there's common information and that should be read by all roles. So there's background information and there's common information from an appendices perspective. Then there is specific information for your role. So you want to make sure that you only focus on your role. Today, I'm going to go through the performance management required for the Elgar case. And then there are also specific appendices for your role. So again, just look at the information that is the common information that's for everyone and the role specific for your role. You don't care what everyone else has to do. Just concentrate on what you need to have to do. So the first step is to allocate time to planning. CPA Canada recommends that you allocate 90 minutes for a day 2 case for what we call ROP, which is reading, outlining, and planning. So it's important to put the start time of 9 o'clock. You're going to start your exam at 9, and then your stop time should be 10:30. And so roughly what you're allocating that total of 90 minutes is 75 minutes is dedicated to reading the case and creating your outline. Then the other 15 minutes is the time that you're spending. What are you planning to do? Ordering your requireds and allocating your time. The remaining 210 minutes, you're going to turn that outline into your response. Now, once we know what the requireds are, we're going to allocate time for each of those required. So we're going to break that time back down even more. A very important golden rule is you must manage your time well. So it's extremely important that you complete all of the required within the time frame that you're given. And if you haven't had an opportunity yet, please make sure you watch the recording for understanding CFE because I clearly go over the different levels that you need to meet and how they are assessing each of those levels. So it's extremely important that you manage your time well. So The second step is reading the narrative. And within the narrative, there's some very important information. First of all, the required or the assessment opportunities. What are you being asked to do? Your role, the users and their objectives, and the timeline. So the role, that's going to dictate the voice in which you write your response. Do you work for the company or are you a consultant? You're an external individual. Who are the users and what are their objectives? Now, this information can be used in a variety of ways. For example, if one of the users is the bank, and we know that when it comes to financial reporting issues, you need to talk about the impact that your recommendation is going to have on the areas that the users are particularly interested in. So the bank is interested in cash flow, and a proxy for cash flow is net income. Also, when it comes to the identifying the users and their objectives, that information also needs to be discussed when you calculate materiality. So the users and their objectives is important. The timeline, it's important to record what's the current date, when is year end, and are there any other dates that are given to you? For example, maybe the current date is June. And one of the options you're looking at that you need to analyze is they're looking at implementing a particular option and the contract starts in September. Well, that could be a very important con because that's a short timeline, which means you might not be able to perform the due diligence that's needed. And as a result, that could negatively impact the implementation of that option. So, what are the best practices? When you're creating your outline, make sure that each required is a heading in your outline. Write that required word for word and break it down into smaller pieces. Don't paraphrase, because if you paraphrase right from the beginning, you might have kind of read over and missed a key point that you need to address. A fundamental principle is if they ask you to do something, it's important that you do it to the best of your ability. Include the relevant case facts in your outline. So again, you can turn that quickly into your response. So what I'm going to do is let's go. What I strongly recommend you do when it comes to day 2 is go to the section that outlines the required for your role. Now, you notice on this slide, I've got paragraphs from the case. And what I've done for illustration purposes only is I've highlighted in yellow the important information. In red, I've also indicated where that information or kind of what category it would fall under in my outline. Now, I want to be very clear. This best practice I'm showing, if it's important, I'm going to include it in my outline. I'm not going to spend time highlighting it, writing in and on the case. If it's important, I am going to include it in my outline. So I'm reading and I'm typing that information that's important. I'm extracting it and including in my outline. So in the first few paragraphs, we've already identified 2 requireds. The first one is that we need to conduct a variance analysis for platinum. So I'm going to use platinum variance analysis as my title, my heading. And I'm going to also include some notes for me. So I know that I need to look at budgeted versus actual. I need to discuss the finding. So whether the variance is favorable or unfavorable. I also want to include a friendly reminder. I need to discuss why the variance is different, why it's favorable or unfavorable, and that needs to be based on case facts. As you start practicing old CFE cases and you debrief and you go through the feedback guide, keep notes. Make sure that you understand what are the key discussion points. And when you're creating your outline, put those discussion points there as a friendly reminder. If you think, oh, I've got to remember to do that, don't assume that you're going to remember it when you actually go to write your response. Put in a note to remind you in your outline. The second required is for the K3 press contract. And they're asking us to perform both a quantitative and a qualitative analysis. And of course, we need to provide a recommendation whether to cancel that contract. So the best thing about using Word is, and creating your outline, is that quantitative qualitative analysis recommendation, that structure, that discussion framework. I'm going to use it most likely for some other requirements. So I have the benefit of copying and pasting that wherever I need it. So let's look at the next paragraph. And here is another required. So when it comes to the Elgar reporting package, there's several things that we're being asked to do. We need to review the measures. So again, I'm putting each of these in bullet point. I'm making sure that I'm going to address each of these individually. So I need to review the measures. I need to provide recommendations for improvements. Plus, they're also asking us to provide suggestions on how they could better monitor the financial results and help NHC in making a decision of whether to further fund Elgar. And I'm putting, again, as a friendly reminder, what that means is I need to provide recommendations when it comes to new measurements. So again, I'm setting up my structure. I'm making sure that I know exactly what they're asking me to do, and I've got it set up. So under each of those points, I can put my information. So the next paragraph, well, here we have all kinds of financial reporting issues. And the appropriate discussion framework to use is IGAR, or I always add the I on, so IGAR-I. So what I'm going to do is there's 4 financial reporting issues. Foreign currency, it's going to be about the K3 contract, revenue under new marketing program, and the future dismantle of the battery construction facility. So again, I'm going to set up my structure. Helps me turn this outline quickly into response. So I'm going to put issue, gap, analysis, recommendation, and impact. And again, I can just copy that format structure under each of the financial reporting issues. So the next few paragraphs, another 2 assessment opportunities. The first one is we need to examine Elgar's proposal. And what they're asking us to do is to compare the actual performance versus what was forecasted. So again, I'm putting a note to myself and saying, okay, I need to, when I'm comparing that performance, I want to make sure that I comment on whether that performance was achieved, if it wasn't achieved, or if it was exceeded. The next required is we're asked to identify risks and provide mitigation strategies. So I'm hoping that the first structure that comes to mind is you're thinking the version of the WIR format. The WI format stands for weakness, or it could be risk or issue. I stands for implication, and R stands for recommendation. So that format works very well when you're asked to identify risks, when you're asked to, look at the different contract terms, when you're asked to identify operational issues or governance issues. And it helps improve your chances of meeting the depth requirement, because one of the things that you need to do is you also need to not only identify the risk, but discuss the implication before you provide a mitigation recommendation. So the next few paragraphs, there's actually three assessment opportunities. So the first one, my heading is 6-month cash flow forecast. And what they're asking us to do, again, I'm breaking it down, putting it in bullet points so I make sure that I do everything they're asking me to do. Is I need to make the necessary changes. I need to identify the areas to reduce costs, which means I need to provide recommendations. And a very important relevant case fact is that they need to maintain a minimum of $3 million cash balance at the end of each month. There is two other options that I need to talk about because they're considering paying their assembly employees by piecework. So we need to perform both a quantitative and a qualitative analysis and provide a recommendation. So there is that structure, that discussion framework that I'm going to use. And I also can copy that because that's the same structure I should use for my response when it comes to the electric bicycle option. Now we're getting close to the end of the requires. So the last two requirements we have to do for the performance management role is they're asking us to provide recommendations when it comes to governance and oversight. Specifically, they're asking us to provide recommended changes to the board of directors, structure, and policies and processes. So again, a very good discussion framework structure to use is WIR, weakness, implication, and recommendation. They're also asking us to look at their current performance management system. They're asking us to evaluate the current performance indicators. So I already know that I need to explain why they are or are not appropriate. Plus, I also need to provide recommendations. So I need to provide new measurements. And I need to state and explain why they are appropriate. So at this point, we have now completed and we've read the narrative for the performance management requirements. So at this point, I would recommend that you actually take one of the blank pages from your rough booklet and you write each of those requireds down. It's a step you're going to need to do at some point anyway. Let's do it now because before you look at the common information, you want to make sure that you know what your requireds are. Because the common information, everybody's going to be looking through it. And there's information you need to shift through it and you need to figure out what information is applicable for your requirements. There's some information there that's for someone who's doing the assurance role or the finance role. So let's write all of those down. So now step 3 is to scan those appendices and again reread the requirements. When and then step 4 is all about carefully reading those appendices and organizing those case facts, so extracting the relevant case facts. So I want to go over a few important questions to ask yourself. And it's just, when you're given information, look at it and ask yourself, so why was I given that? When it comes to the common information, you need to ask yourself, does that information relate to my required? If it doesn't, it's not something you need to include in your outline. When it comes to your role specific and you're looking at the narrative and you're looking at the appendices for your role, ask yourself why you were given that information. If you are given an exhibit and it's under your role, you know that there's information there that you need. Ask yourself, how does that information relate to the users and their objectives? When clients make statements, when the user makes statements in the case, look at those statements with skepticism because they might have done something, they might have recorded revenue recognition incorrectly. If when you're reading that statement and you know that they've done something incorrect, then you know that you need to address that and advise them, provide your appropriate analysis, and advise them of what they need to do. So for step 3, when it comes to the Elgar case, the common appendices, there's actually 3 of them. And so there's some common information about Elgar. So I'm going to need some of that and we're going to go through it. For Appendix 2, there's excerpts from Elgar's draft financial statement. So I'll probably need something from there. So again, I'm just kind of scanning them. Appendix 3 is going to be a very important appendix because there's all kinds of information there that I know that I need. When it comes to platinum inventory, the K3 press contract, the key measurements report, the foreign currency transactions, the new marketing program, and the battery construction. So a lot of the information around the management assessment opportunity, accounting opportunities, and financial reporting opportunities, they're all in that appendices. When I scan the performance management appendices, there's information there. Oh, for the Elgar's proposal, great, I need that. The Elgar's cash flow, yes. Piecework, the electronic bike proposal, and the performance indicators. So we've scanned it quickly. Now what we need to do is extract the relevant information. It's important to pay attention to the details. So when you're looking at, say that there's financial statements, make sure that you know what time frame it covers. It might be only for 6 months and you need to do a forecast for a year, or it might only be for 9 months. Be careful. Pay attention to the details. Make sure that you note the quantitative and qualitative information separately. And I'm going to show you that as we extract some information and put it into our outline. Make sure that there are some case facts that apply to more than one required. For example, the user's objectives. If they're concerned about the impact to net income, that is something you need to discuss under impact, a part of your IGAR. If you are asked to calculate materiality, that's also an important consideration. So make sure, again, the benefit of Word is you can put it under the appropriate category and then copy it and put that information under the other required. When you're looking at the financial statements, what type of assurance has been provided? Are those statements audited or are they not audited? If they're unaudited, there's a good chance that there are some errors and adjustments need to be made. How many years of information are you presented with? Because if you are asked to perform a ratio analysis and you have 2 years, then you know that you need to calculate the ratios for both years and you know you need to discuss the trend. Is the ratio improving? Is it getting worse or is it stable? Look at the line items. Are there line items with large dollar values? If there is, and you're asked to identify high risk accounts, that could be a trigger. Are there large changes year over year? If there is, there's a chance there's something incorrect. Is there something that you'd expect to see and it's not present? Or is there something that you wouldn't expect to see and it is present? So again, look at that information with skepticism. So let's go and start looking at the background information. So this is something every role needs to go through. So there's several users, and the biggest thing when it comes to the objective is that NHC, so they own 100% of Elgar. They are either going to sell Elgar or they want to ensure the company eventually produces a steady cash flow. There's several members that are identified as far as from NHC and also from Elgar itself. And your role is, that was under your performance management requirements, is that you're part of NHC investigation team. And you notice here, it provides, it tells us that the desired return on investment is 25% after tax. So one of the things I always say, if there are some quantitative information in the narrative, pull it out, put it in your outline. Make sure you have that information because most likely there is a chance you're going to need it when you go to perform your quantitative analysis. So I'm going to show you how I normally put that, and then I'll move it around once I know where it applies. So in the next paragraph, there's already some valuable information here that I need for one of the performance management requirements, and that's around governance and oversight. So for the board of directors, we have a weakness. So Robin, who is Elgar's CEO, he's the only board member. So again, I'm just going to put that under weakness. I'll put the rest of the information in when I go to write my response. Under policies and procedures, there's no formal oversight or approval of Elgar's policies by NHC. So we're already starting to extract some information and starting to get at least the substance that were needed to help us increase our chances of meeting the breadth requirement for that particular assessment opportunity. Also, it says that Charlene performs a brief review of the Elgar's monthly report package and then she archives it. So another weakness, and that follows under policies and procedures. So we already have identified 3 weaknesses for that particular assessment opportunity. The next paragraph outlines our timeline. So in this instance, this version of the case is June 22nd. Year end is already gone by. It was May 31st. There's some important qualitative information. So I'm going to include that in my outline. I'm just going to include a section, quantitative information. And they were forecasted, Elgar was forecasted to achieve $1 million pre-tax income for year end, and they actually had a loss. They sold 812 units, and the average sale price was 37,806. So I'm going to put that in there because I might need it when I go to perform my quantitative analysis. Then the next appendices, so now I've gone through all the background information. Now I'm going to go to the appendix. Here's some important information. So Elgar is IFRS. So under GAAP, I'm going to put IFRS and I'm going to copy that and put IFRS under each of those financial reporting issues. Also, it says that the tax rate is 28% and that the incremental borrow rate is 8%. So I know that if I needed to do an MPV or anything, I would need, that's my discount factor. So again, I'm going to record that information there. Might need it, might not. But my chances of, if I don't include it in my outline, I'm most likely going to miss it. When it comes to, they include a mission statement. And already based on my practice and my familiarity with cases, I know when it comes to my qualitative analysis, I'm going to need to consider whether implementing that option is aligned with different components of Elgar's mission statement. So I'm going to put that information under electric bicycle. The next few paragraphs identify several risks. So I'm going to pull that information because that was one of the assessment opportunities, and I'm going to put each of those risks. Again, I'll go back and when I write the response, I'll put in the implication and the recommendations. So for, in the spirit of the fact that we have limited time, I'm going to skip Appendix 2 and I'm going to go to Appendix 3. And here, there's a lot of valuable information when it comes to the platinum inventory, the variance analysis we need to perform. Now, it is up to you how you handle this, how you accumulate and take your quantitative information. So in your outline, you could just put the page number for the quantitative analysis. Um, I am, and I find many of the candidates tell me that they're kind of kinesthetic learners. So in other words, things don't make an awful lot of sense unless you're actually looking at it and doing something with it. Because day 2 case is very vast, I always just extract some of the relevant information. So there's some standard, I know I need the standard price, I know I need the standard quantity. So I'm going to put that into my outline. There's some very important information here. Remember, I needed to talk about why the variance was different, so whether it's favorable or unfavorable, and use specific case facts to support that. Here are some very important case facts. Limited inventory counts. The scientists, they have access 24 hours a day, and that wastage, and they're uncertain of the amount. So already, before I've even calculated, this is already telling me that most likely from an efficiency perspective, the variance is going to be unfavorable because of these reasons. So for sure, when I extract that information, I'm going to put this information here plus the page number under the quantitative. I'm going to put, as a reminder, I know I need to do the flexible budget variance. I know I need to do an efficiency variance and a price variance. And I'm going to put the important case facts so I can use that to explain the reason for the variances. And then I need to provide recommendations. So you're going to do the same process that I've showed you all the way through for your role specific AOs also. So extract the relevant information. Step 5 is all about taking a moment to pause. And what you need to ask yourself is, how do those those issues, how do they fit together? What's most important to the person who's reading your memo? And what's the most important issue for the users of the financial statements? Step 6 is all about planning what you're going to do. Well, if you're using the best practice that I'm sharing, you're already planning what you're going to do. You've already know who the users are and what their objectives are. And you've already included that relevant information under the appropriate requirements. You already know which required you need to perform both the quantitative and qualitative analysis. You already know the types of recommendations you need to make because you've identified those under your requirements. The last 2 points is you need to consider how do those required integrate. What that means is how does your analysis of one required and your recommendation of that required impact your analysis of another required? Because that will dictate the order in which you complete those required. So a very important example is if you have financial reporting issues, you must do those first. Okay, let me repeat that. If you have financial reporting issues, you must do those first because your recommendations must be implemented. Those adjustments must be made from a quantitative perspective before you perform other quantitative analysis. For example, if you're asked to calculate materiality, you need to Make the appropriate adjustments first. Say the materiality base is going to be net income. Those adjustments need to be made first. So financial reporting issues need to be addressed first. The step 7 and 8 are really done in tangent. And so you're ordering the required and you're ranking them. From a logical flow of your response, you're going to consider which transaction or what's riskier that would have impact on cash flow, simply by the volume of coverage. If there's a lot of big appendices that's dedicated to that, it's an important issue that needs to be addressed. When it comes to step 9, you're allocating your time. You're not. You are not going to take and say, well, I have 210 minutes, I have 14 assessment opportunities, so therefore I'm just going to evenly allocate time for each of those assessment opportunities. No, the factors you need to consider is how much information do you already have in your outline? So if you already have a lot of information, now in this case, the required wasn't that you performed a SWOT analysis, but say it was. And you have all kinds of factors already there. And all you need to include is the why. What's the potential positive or negative impact? Well, then you only need to allocate 5 to 7 minutes. For those risks, all you need to do is talk about the implication and recommendations. You need less time to do that, then perform a cash flow analysis. Think about too in the context of what are some of the requirements that you can do very efficiently and quickly. Make sure that you allocate that remaining time for each of the assessment opportunities. You have to stick to your time budget. So have that start time, have that finish time. And one of the sayings we say is done is better than perfect. You do not need a perfect response to achieve a competent, rating. Again, you do not need a perfect quantitative or a perfect response. So you want to make sure that you do the best that you can within the time frame that you have. Because remember, there are certain markers that you need to achieve in order to pass each of the levels. So again, if you haven't watched Understanding CFE, please make sure that you watch that recording. So here is kind of based on what the outline is that I created for the entire case. This is how I would have allocated my time. You notice, so 90 minutes for my reading, outlining, and planning. And then depending on the assessment opportunity, I would allocate anywhere from 10 minutes, maybe 15, 20, or 25 minutes. You will also notice that I've included 15 minutes for review. So leave some time at the end so you can quickly go through that information and make sure that you've done everything that you've been asked to do. So I want to take a little bit of time and talk about some of the common analysis you're going to be asked to do. So let's look at one of them is performing both a quantitative and qualitative analysis. So the general approach is that you should calculate and perform your quantitative analysis first, then your qualitative analysis. The reason being is because when you perform your quantitative analysis, you might find some hidden issues. For example, maybe you're calculating NPV. What happens is you notice that in the first 2 years, there's negative cash flow. Well, that's an important an important qualitative factor that needs to be considered because those first 2 years, that negative cash flow will have to be supported by the company's cash from operations or it will have to be financed. When it comes to your quantitative analysis, make sure that you include a purpose. So what is the question that you're trying to answer? And what is your conclusion? What are the results of your quantitative analysis? When you're performing a complex quantitative analysis, break it into, say, two sections so it's easier to follow. So the first section would kind of include that high-level summary of your findings, and then the second section is going to have those detailed calculations. So a common example, let me go back to this again. A common example is, say that you were asked to calculate business income. And so there's many, you might have in your top section just one line for the total deductions, one line for the total add backs. But in your second section, you're going to have each of these items individually laid out. That way, your analysis is very easy to follow. So when you're planning your quantitative analysis, there's really three tasks that you generally need to be completed. You need to determine the purpose of your analysis. What question are you trying to answer? Then you need to look at the information that's available to you, because that information triggers and helps you determine, in conjunction with the question you're trying to answer, that helps you determine the appropriate tool that you should be using. So one of the things is, if you find that you struggle determining the appropriate tool and quantitative analysis you should perform, tomorrow when I do time management in day 3, I dedicate some time to going over some of the common quantitative tools. And I'm going to talk about the types of information and questions they answer. So one of the best practices too, that again, your starting point. So think about it. If you have to recalculate net income, start with the current net income. Don't start with revenue. Start with the current net income and then make the appropriate adjustments. And I wanted again to emphasize, you're not expected to perform a perfect quantitative analysis. It doesn't need to be perfect in order to achieve a competent response. Your quantitative analysis, that should be performed in Excel. Your response should be performed in Word. Your Excel calculations, you should not be copying those calculations into Word unless you're specifically directed to do so. And to date, I've never seen a case where you've been asked to do that. I want to highlight this very important fact. Remember that your CFE, the CFE marker, doesn't have the opportunity to ask you to provide further clarification. They can't send me a text or an email or a message and say, Debbie, how did you arrive at that number under the initial investment? You have $1 million. What did you include that ended up resulting in that input number? So it's important to include notes when it comes to your input numbers if you have a formula in that cell. So think about it in the context that the marker is looking at a PDF form. Okay, they're looking at the PDF sheet of your quantitative analysis. Can they figure out how you arrived at the input number? Now, you don't need to include notes that explain basic math, like, sales price minus variable cost equals contribution. But if you've got an input number, say for revenue, you're going to add 5% annually, then make sure revenue, you kind of put bracket, 5% increase annually. They've got to know, what did you include? So notes are critical. And for those of you who are enrolled in Capstone 2, you're going to see that in the feedback guide, it will say supported notes. You need notes. Even if you got the right answer, you need notes. So when it comes to a quantitative analysis on its own, that's not enough to achieve a competent response. You need to include valuable information in your memo. And that includes, you need to, of course, to reference the exhibit number. Now, you can't just say, see Exhibit 1 and that's it. You need to state what the result is. So if the NPV is positive of 100,000, then you put NPV is positive 100,000. You need to interpret that result. So what does that mean? So you can state, in a very quick sentence that based on the quantitative analysis, this is a viable option. It's also important, and it doesn't always need to be done, but be on the lookout. So based on the case facts, is some is there some information that kind of says, hey, you know what? The say you've used, I don't know, 10% revenue growth. And the case facts tell you that the industry growth is 5%. Well, that's an important assumption to highlight. And what I would put is a subcategory under my quantitative analysis of assumption and say, say that 10% revenue growth was used. However, industry growth is 5%. If revenue growth is closer to industry growth, that would have a negative impact on NPV. So again, the kind of assumptions that you need to discuss are the ones that the case facts that are provided to you are kind of, giving you the indicating that that assumption might be different than what you've used. And so the users need to know you're telling me that that's positive and that that's viable from a quantitative analysis, from a quantitative perspective. But how accurate is those assumptions? Because if they are significantly different, that 100,000 could easily turn into a negative NPV. So they want to know to what degree and how much confidence they should have in the quantitative analysis. When it comes to your qualitative analysis, so when you're talking about the pros, the cons, advantages, disadvantages, risks or opportunities, doesn't matter what you use as subtitles, but it's important to not just simply state case facts. They gave you the case facts. You need to answer the question, so what? You need to talk about what the potential positive or negative impact to the company is. Now, I've worked with a lot of candidates and they said, but Debbie, it's obvious. Well, what's obvious to you isn't always necessarily obvious to someone else. And remember, the marker can only give you credit for what's on the page. So you've got to include and answer that question, so what? What is the potential positive or negative impact? This is one of the top 3 reasons why people fail CFE. And it's one of the easiest things to fix. So please do not fall into that trap. When it comes to your recommendation, you need to ensure that your recommendation is a comprehensive recommendation. So you need to provide what is known as a supported recommendation. What is that? That is that you highlight the strongest quantitative and qualitative. So what are the 2 to 3 strongest qualitative reasons for your recommendations, whether you recommend to implement an option or not implement an option? Do not say, based on my quantitative and qualitative analysis, I recommend implementing this option. As they're testing you, and the expectations is what an entry-level CPA advice should provide, an analysis they should perform. Not all qualitative factors are equal. So what are the most important reasons why you are or aren't recommending it? And 99% of the time, you should be able to provide the user with a recommendation based on the information that you have at hand. If there is, so say you've calculated the valuation and you notice, and it's based on the financial statements, and you notice that they're unaudited, okay? Provide a recommendation based on your quantitative and qualitative analysis, highlight the strongest reasons why, and then kind of have a caveat and state before you purchase, okay, so say you're purchasing this company, it's important to ask that you have access to audited financials so that you can ensure the valuation is that the asking price and the valuation is appropriate. So that's kind of a clarification of what they need to do. When you performed your qualitative analysis, if there's a key risk or something that you're really concerned about, still provide a recommendation and provide a mitigation strategy for that key risk. So you as a CPA, your recommendations and your rationale behind them is extremely important. So let's spend a little bit of time of going over financial reporting assessment opportunities because we want to close that gap between a reaching competent and a competent response. So one of the things that I want you to really reflect, especially as you start to practice the cases, ask yourself, are these areas that you struggle with and what do you need to do differently? So are you failing to recognize what the issue is? You haven't identified the required. Are you using the wrong reporting framework? Are you failing to incorporate appropriate case facts? So instead, what you're doing is you're copying and pasting the entire, criteria from the handbook. I want to be very clear. The chances of you achieving reaching competent is not very high, let alone a competent, if you're simply just going to copy the full criteria from the handbook. You need to apply the relevant case facts. Some candidates, they simply jump to the conclusion. It's the right conclusion, but that's not a competent response because the marker must understand your rationale. The analysis piece is very important. So I'm going to go into this in greater detail. So I've already talked about the appropriate structure that you need to use when you are analyzing financial reporting issues. For those of you who've been in the professional education program, that particular structure relates very much to the CPA way. So step one of the CPA way is to assess the situation, and that's all around issue identification and what's the appropriate accounting framework. Of course, step two is analyze the issue, so that's the A. Step three is the conclude and advise, which is the R, the recommendation. So when it comes to assess the situation, you need to identify the following things. Make sure that you have a clear understanding of what has happened. So have they already performed a journal entry? Because if they have and it's incorrect, you need to advise what the corrections are that need to be done. Or what are they planning to do? Have a very quick synopsis of the situation. What's the potential issue? Be on the lookout. Is there more than one financial reporting issue? Now, I want to provide you with a very common example, and that's around revenue recognition. So say that a user says that they received a signing bonus, which they've recorded as revenue, and they've also recorded as revenue. They've sent their first shipment to their customer. But there is a right of return. The customer is able to return the product, within the next 30 days. Those are two separate financial reporting revenue recognition issues. You need to address them individually. Which accounting framework? You cannot achieve a competent response if you're using IFRS when the company uses ASPE. Who are the key users and what are the areas that they are interested in? So make sure when you're making your issue statement that you explain why it is an issue, but don't come to a conclusion. Don't say they've incorrectly recorded revenue because you need to perform that analysis first. So in the instance I gave you is the issue is when to recognize the signing bonus and what amount. So step 2 is the analysis piece. And it's very important. A best practice is that you should paraphrase each criterion individually. So if there's 3 criteria, state the first criterion. Underneath in bullet point, apply the relevant case fact. Under that, state whether that criterion is met or not. Now, one of the things I strongly encourage you to do is look at, so again, if you haven't watched the stress management webinar, one of the things that I've done is I've showed you how to take the Excel tool and sort it. So when you're looking at the financial reporting issues, you should be comfortable with what is the criteria and be able to paraphrase it in your own words for all of those financial reporting issues that are level A, because you need to apply those relevant case facts. Copying simply from, I mean, you do have access to the handbook. You can forget some of the criteria. You will need to copy some of the information, but the more that you can paraphrase, the more that you can quickly prepare your response. Make sure. So normally after you perform your analysis, you need to provide a conclusion. But however, in some circumstances, there's an option to make an accounting policy choice. So for example, under ASPE, when it comes to development costs, and if they meet the criteria for the intangible asset, they have a choice of either capitalizing it or expending it or expensing it. So you need to talk about both options. You need to consider what the user's needs are. If the user is wanting to minimize tax payable, then your recommendation is that they should expense it. If they're looking at selling their company and it's based on net income, that means they want their net income as high as possible. So your recommendation is that you're going to capitalize it. So again, you've got to integrate the user's objectives. When it comes to the conclude, your recommendations, you need to provide a recommendation for each of those reporting issues. You are the expert. They're looking to you for your recommendations. So clearly state what your recommendation is and why. Make sure that that recommendation is consistent with your analysis. You also need to talk about what's the impact to the areas that the users are interested in. Does it have a positive impact? Is it going to improve in net income if they're concerned about it? If there's a bank covenants. Provide the user with the journal entries that are needed. Quantify. If you've got the information to be able to calculate what the impact is, quantify it. Hence the reason why I say include impact. So you make sure, so in not just IGAR, but IGAR-I. Using this format also helps you to make sure that your response is clear, concise, it's easy to follow, and it saves you valuable time. So let's talk about what are the expectations from the perspective of the board of directors when it comes to a competent response. So you notice here I have some of the potential assessments. I haven't included NA because that means you haven't addressed the required at all. Nominal competency, that's not going to be considered towards what the requirements are for each of the levels. Reaching competent, that will be considered when it comes to level 1 and level 4. Most importantly is your goal is to achieve as many competent responses as you can. Nominal competent means it's very superficial attempt. Let's go through and drill down, and you notice I've X'd out competent with distinction. Because an understanding CFE, I clearly indicated there's no extra reward for you achieving a competent with distinction. You need to move on, create a competent response and move on. And that comes with practice. So competent response meets both the breadth and the depth requirements. Let's go through this again because it's important. So qualitative analysis, that's identifying a sufficient number of appropriate qualitative factors based on the case facts provided. Quantitative, it's including a sufficient number of appropriate and correctly calculated inputs. From a depth perspective, for qualitative analysis, it's discussing that why and that impact. From a quantitative perspective, it's interpreting those results, okay? So again, knowing, hitting those markers when it comes to what the requirements are in your memo. It's identifying those key assumptions and talking about the impact that that would have, whether it's positive or negative. Do not say if the assumptions are different, then the quantitative result would be different. That's basic math. You need to say why it might be different and whether it would have a positive or negative impact. For reaching competent response, that means that you've missed the mark on either depth and or breadth. So in this aspect, we've actually started the webinars earlier, and I'm hoping that you're finding that very valuable. So as you complete your cases and start to practice, and that should be happening soon, ask yourself, were you able to identify all the assessment opportunities? If not, was it because that you were reading too quickly? Did you know you had a problem because of lack of the required technical knowledge? Or did you have trouble communicating your analysis in an appropriate way? So what happens is the assumption is that most candidates fail the CFE because they don't have the technical skills. And that, for some, that is true. But for others, that's not the case. For others, it's all around your enabling competencies. And that's about your ability to write an efficient and effective response, your ability to manage your time, and your ability to focus on the key factors that you need to consider when you're performing your analysis and providing your recommendations. So you're being tested on your ability to focus on what's the most important things, that you have a clear understanding of the key factors that need to be considered to ensure that your recommendations are viable and credible. You're not being tested on every bit of information you know about something. So information dumping is non-value added. The reason that you're given a time constraint is because, again, you're being tested on your ability to focus on the key factors. From a technical perspective, make sure you watch that stress management piece. Pull out that Excel spreadsheet. Create the ones I recommend, because remember that for day 2, you're going to be tested at the elective level. For day 3 and day 1, you're tested at the core level. Sort it. Focus on proficiency level A, then B, then C. It's important to track your performance and think about it, your performance, and write notes to remind yourself, see that you're improving. Write notes about your behaviors. Are there certain things that you're doing that are negatively impacting your ability to successfully achieve a competent response? Maybe like you're reading too fast. So say, Debbie, you need to slow down. Debbie, manage your time. Okay, Debbie, create an outline, extract that relevant case facts. Don't just create a shell where you just have the requirements. If you're missing certain triggers, like there's only so many ways they can ask you to perform a contribution analysis. They're not going to say that, but they're going to say, you know what, we're thinking of adding a product and we're wanting to determine which product mix is going to give us the highest profitability. So write down some of those triggers. Write down some of the triggers that tend to happen, the types of quantitative information that you're given, and how that helps determine the appropriate tool that you use. write down the areas that you're struggling from a technical review piece so that again, when you look at your study time, that's where you're going to go back and spend your time. There's lots of valuable resources. So for day 2 and day 3 sample cases, everyone has access to Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. And I have here right where you can find the study plan material. There's 18 units. There's 6 day 3 and 2 day 2. So they give you the case, the solution, the feedback guide, debrief notes, and walkthrough. For those of you, when you get at who are enrolled in Capstone 2 and you get access to it, they will also give you additional practice cases. And that information, I know the last Capstone 2, they had several day 2 extra and day 3 cases that ran from September 2015 through to May 2023. When it comes to the day 1 case, the only information that you have accessible to is the board of examiners reports if you're not enrolled in Capstone 2. If you're enrolled in Capstone 2, you will have access to 3 sample day 1 cases. I want to highlight that chapter. You've got your ebooks, which are wonderful, particularly the snapshots, very helpful. And chapter 7 in your enabling competency. And that all goes around the Elgar and when you're analyzing financial reporting issues. There's flashcards, and I've included here, I've included what a flashcard looks like. So revenue recognition from IFRS outlines the 5 steps. There's a card that specifically focuses on identifying performance obligation. So they've got some of the work already done for you. And of course, these support webinars. All of this information has been extracted from the Board of Examiners reports for the last 7 years. So stress management, understanding CFE, those recordings are they're already available on the homepage in D2L for Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. This particular webinar, that recording will be available shortly. Tomorrow, same time and same place, I'm going to do day 3 and time management. And next week, on April the 8th, I'm going to share a best practice and go through the day 1 case, the garnet bread. If you're going to write that one, if not, if you're writing Viviana, that is on April the 9th. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you may have.
All right, no, thanks there, Debbie, for the great presentation there. So just to let everybody know, so we'll be posting the recording to tonight's webinar on the Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE homepage on that newsfeed post where you guys registered for today's webinar there. So just to give it a couple of days for the recordings that are there. And you'll see the recording will be to the YouTube site for the CPA Western School of Business, just to let you guys know of there. So we'll spend about 10 minutes or so on the Q&A section there. So I'll answer some questions that have come in terms I'll ask Debbie to provide her thoughts in regards to there. But yeah, it'll be approximately about 10 minutes, and feel free to use the Q&A function if you got any questions, as well, we have a team behind the scenes as well to help answer any questions that we got here. So Debbie, the first question is going to come up, and it's come up on quite a few webinars previously, historically in the past, in regards to there. So it's more about figuring out. So for when you do a qualitative analysis and a quantitative analysis, how many points are needed to get competent or to get depth?
Okay.
In regards to what's the magic number? That's what the question
Okay.
is.
Well, first of all, you're not going to like my answer because nobody knows what the magic number is. So if someone tells you that, oh, you need to have so many qualitative factors, nobody knows. The only people who do are the people who've created CFE and who are marking it. But there are some fundamental principles. So when you're extracting The qualitative factors, include them in your analysis. When you allocate your time, write your response and include as many as you possibly can. So, in other words, you don't need to include all of them to achieve a competent response. But one of the things 1 year is the fundamental principle is the more that they give you, the more that they expect you to include. And some of the candidates thought, oh, well, they figured that as long as I have, so many pros, so many cons, I'm good. And in this particular case, there were many provided, and the expectation to meet Brett was higher than it normally is. So again, be dictated by how much time you have and what information you have. Okay? Because I don't know, and nobody knows except the people who created the exam, and they certainly aren't going to share that with us ahead of time.
All right. No, that's great there, Debbie. No, thanks for that there. Yeah, so there's no magic bullet in terms of there. So what you guys will find as you do cases and as you practice more and more cases, you'll kind of get a sense of, oh, this is the amount of detail that's required. So it's something that I like to say it takes a lot of time and practice in regards to that there. All right, thank you, Debbie. The next question has to do with using the CP Canada handbook. So, when referring to the handbook, and I know you mentioned this here before, but it's a question that's come up. Can the candidates directly copy and paste an extract into their answer from the handbook, or should they paraphrase? And how much should they copy and write from the handbook to gap? Like, does that add depth to their answer there?
Okay, so very good question. First of all, there are going to be times that you're going to want to copy information from the handbook. Know that it takes time for you to go into the handbook. It takes time for you to copy that information. If you need to go into the handbook and copy the criteria for every single financial reporting issue, I can tell you, you will not complete all of the requirements. So again, be guided by the proficiency levels. So if it is a financial reporting issue that is proficiency level A, that means that you need to know that financial reporting issue extremely well. So you should be able to paraphrase that criteria. Simply copying and pasting is just saying, I know how to copy and paste. It's adding no value. What you need to do is integrate, include the relevant case facts to support your conclusion about whether that criteria is met or not. And what I've seen is with candidates, when they copy large sections, they end up putting a paragraph underneath and they don't end up applying all of the relevant case facts for each of the criteria, which means they end up not achieving a competent response. So my answer is yes, you have access to it. Will it increase your chances of meeting the breadth, the depth requirement? No, it won't, because more often than not, you aren't going to apply the relevant case facts. And that you don't just need the criteria, you need the relevant case facts and to correctly state if that criteria is met or not. So use it sparingly. Use those flashcards. Make sure that you know what financial reporting issues you need to know well. Make sure you practice using NOSHA so that you can navigate quickly and that you can get the information you need. But do not copy and paste large sections repeatedly. Even using Surpass, if you continue to do that, the system, it's not really Word, it's a fake version of Word, it'll kick you out. We can get you back really quick, less than a minute, but it adds no value. So you need to be comfortable with the criteria and then use the handbook when you need to.
All right. No, thank you there, Debbie. In regards to that there. So yeah, that's a common thing we want to reiterate to candidates there. So I know there's been other couple of other questions related to the handbook. We also want to make sure that in the newsfeed post, we do have a FAQ in there and a couple of suggestions on potential chapters which you can read in the enabling competency ebooks on how to reference the handbook there. So we encourage candidates to review over that as well. In terms of another question here, Debbie, so this is the question that has come up. So now whereby candidates may have not seen their first CFE case, or they're starting to just do their CFE case and practice case. And what they see is that they see a suggested solution that's provided in the Board of Examiners report. And then once you see that, you're kind of like, wow, is that what's expected of us during an exam setting there? So just wanted to get your thoughts in terms
Sure.
of what are the expectations candidates should have when writing their
Sure.
references.
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer that in two parts. So for those of you who are enrolled in Capstone 2, you're going to get access to a solution guide. That solution guide is competent with distinction. Use it as a learning tool. That, they provide some really good explanations, but it was not completed within the time frame that you were given. It was completed by maybe more than one person. So it is not an appropriate guide to determine what you can do within the time frame you're given. They also provide you with a sample, a strong sample response, and the corresponding marked feedback guide. That's where I would focus my energy because that is a response that was created by an actual candidate within the time frame that's given. If you're not enrolled in Capstone 2 and you're looking at the marking guide, they're going to talk about all of what the requirements are. They also include a sample response of a passing candidate. Again, look at that sample response and look at what they did, and that gives you a better sense of what can be done within the time that you have. So please understand that the solution in Capstone 2 is not attainable. Look at those sample responses.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, yeah, we just want to reiterate the solution is there for your reference. So, like, if you didn't understand why a certain thing made sense or not, it's there to help you out. You're not expected to replicate that because there's no potential way to do that in regards to there. So, don't be discouraged if you see where your response compared to the ideal solution response there. Main thing is to focus on your response compared to what the criteria is for each of those particular areas. So
Yeah,
thank you, Debbie,
you're
for that there.
welcome.
So we'll do one last question there. And we apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions. And I'd like to thank my colleagues in the back there who are helping answering the questions there, which we weren't able to get on the video here. But the last question, I specifically left this for last, is for day two. So with day two, there is for those who have watched the Understanding the CFE video, there's four levels in regards to passing profile for days 2 and 3. And for day two, there's your role specific assessment opportunities. So for many candidates, they've heard, oh, you only get that chance in day two. So you got to make sure you rate those first before you address the common assessment opportunities there, mainly in FR and MA there. So want to get your thoughts there again, Debbie. I know you talked about this earlier, but want to reiterate it to close tonight's webinar. The thought about the approach in regards to day two.
Sure. And I'm going to answer that shortly. I do want to provide you with some encouragement. The first time you look at a day one case, a day two case, and a day three case, you're going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to think, I can't remember anything. Know that that is normal. Okay. the important piece is practice, practice, practice. Now, when it comes to, yes, it is correct that day two is the only time that you have the ability to meet the depth requirements when it comes to level three for your role. However, there are also close to equally the same amount of combined financial reporting and management accounting issues. And one of the things I clearly said is if there are financial reporting issues, they must be done first because that analysis and your recommendations are going to impact some of your other requires. And that could be some of the requires that are under your role specific. So if you do your role specific and you're asked to calculate materiality and you haven't made the appropriate adjustments, then that is going to negatively impact your ability to achieve a competent on that assurance assessment opportunity. So again, you can't, you fundamentally, you need to complete all of the assessment opportunities within the time frame you're given because there aren't going to be, if you looked at the number of assessment opportunities combined between day two and day three, normally on a day two, you have, 3 to 4 financial reporting issues, 3 to 4 management accounting issues. Well, if you don't address those, you can't make up for those lost assessment opportunities on day three because there aren't going to be as many of those. So mathematically, that would negatively impact your ability. Sure, it might result that, you end up passing level three, but you don't end up passing level one, and you don't end up passing level two or level one. So again, you've got to complete all of them within the time frame that you're given. That's the strategy. And you need to look at those financial reporting issues, handle them quickly. Don't spend an exorbitant amount of time, disproportional amount of time on those particular issues or the management accounting. Spend the appropriate time all the way through so that you can get everything done. That's the appropriate strategy.
All right. No, thanks there, Debbie. I'm glad you ended it on that particular topic there because that will lead into tomorrow's webinar on time management. So that's great there. So time management strategies and everything like that. So we encourage everyone, if possible, to attend the webinar recording tomorrow live, same time that will occur there. It'll be a different link, so it'll be based off your registration link for tomorrow's webinar. So we encourage everyone to come in there. And Debbie, on behalf of this CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, CPA Atlantic School of Business, and all the CPA provincial regions, we thank you in terms of for hosting tonight's webinar there. And we thank everyone else for attending tonight.
Yes.
And we encourage you. I know this is the first step. One thing I'm going to say is if you feel overwhelmed, that is perfectly fine.
Yeah.
That's okay. We just want to get all this information there out to you. So you're not alone. We're here to help support you guys. We want to see you across the finish line in regards to there. But
Absolutely.
otherwise, I'll let you guys go. Have a great rest of the night, and we hope to see you guys again tomorrow.